It began, as history so often does, not with a declaration of war but with a whisper in a hotel room. The year was 1953. The Cold War had turned the world into a chessboard of fear, and Washington's greatest obsession was a word: oil. In Tehran, halfway across the world, a frail, bespectacled man named Mohammad Mossadegh stood before his parliament and announced something that shook empires. Iran, he said, would take back its own oil. That single-act nationalization was enough to set in motion one of the most consequential covert operations in American history, Operation Ajax. The dream of a free Iran. Mossadegh was no radical. He was a lawyer educated in Europe, a believer in constitutional monarchy, rule of law, and national pride. For decades, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, controlled by the British, had pumped billions of barrels from Iranian soil and returned only crumbs to the Iranian people. Villages near Abadan refinery were choking in poverty while ships filled with Persian crude lit the lamps of London. When Mossadegh rose to power in 1951, he carried with him a dream shared by millions, that Iran could stand on its own feet. He passed a law reclaiming Iranian oil from British control. The crowds poured into the streets chanting his name. Newspapers called him a hero. Even Time magazine named him Man of the Year. But in London, the news landed like a thunderclap. The British elite saw it not as independence, but theft. And so they decided to teach Iran a lesson. 2. The British set the stage. The British response was swift and ruthless. They imposed a global embargo on Iranian oil, strangling the young democracy's economy. But Britain alone couldn't finish the job, the empire was fading. They needed new muscle, American muscle. In Washington, the Eisenhower administration had just come to power. The world was split between communism and capitalism, and every national movement looked suspiciously red. The British found the perfect pitch: Mossadegh is going communist. It wasn't true. Mossadegh had actually banned Iran's Communist Party from office. But facts mattered little in the feverish air of the Cold War. Enter the CIA, still young, hungry, and eager to prove its worth. At its helm stood Allen Dulles, a man who believed in covert action as a clean instrument of foreign policy. Beside him, his brother John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, shared the same conviction. Together, they decided that Mossadegh had to go. The operation was given a code name Ajax, but history remembers it simply as Operation Ajax. 3. The blueprint for regime change. In the spring of 1953, a CIA officer named Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, arrived quietly in Tehran. His briefcase contained more than maps and memos. It carried cash, millions of dollars in bribes, propaganda plans, and a strategy for engineered chaos. The plan was classic. Undermine Mossadegh's government through newspapers and street rumors. Convince the Shah, Iran's timid monarch, to dismiss him. Stage demonstrations, pay off clerics, buy politicians, and, if needed, unleash mob violence. Roosevelt set up base in a safe house near the American embassy. His contact list included generals, gang leaders, and journalists. Soon, Tehran's papers began to turn on Mossadegh, calling him a dictator, a traitor, a Soviet puppet. Fake headlines screamed of communist plots. Ordinary Iranians were confused, angry, frightened. By August, the city was a cauldron. 4. The first coup fails. On the night of August 15, 1953, the CIA made its move. Royal decrees, signed under pressure by the Shah, ordered Mossadegh's dismissal. But the plot leaked. Mossadegh's loyalists arrested the coup leaders. The Shah, terrified, fled the country, first to Baghdad and then to Rome. It seemed over. In Washington, Eisenhower was embarrassed. In London, officials despaired. Mossadegh appeared triumphant, standing as proof that a small nation could defy the West. But Kermit Roosevelt refused to give up. For 3 days he worked the phones, handing out more money, spreading new rumors. He told generals that Mossadegh was preparing mass executions. He told clerics the prime minister planned to abolish Islam. Tehran descended into madness. The second coup succeeds. August 19. Dawn broke over Tehran to the sound of engines and shouting. Roosevelt's agents had paid truck drivers, soldiers, and street thugs to flood the capital. They waved pictures of the Shah and chanted, "Long live the king." The army switched sides. Tanks rolled through the streets. Shots echoed against ancient walls. By afternoon, Mossadegh's house was surrounded. He ordered his men not to fire on fellow Iranians, but the mob had no mercy. They stormed the gates, looted his home, burned what they found. Mossadegh surrendered before sunset. That evening, the Shah returned in glory. And in Washington, champagne glasses clinked. America had pulled off its first modern coup quietly, efficiently, and without a single U.S. soldier in sight. 6. The price of victory. The rewards were immediate. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was reborn as a consortium with American, British, and Dutch partners. Western companies regained control of Iranian oil. The Shah became a trusted ally, a modernizer, pro-Western, and, most importantly, anti-communist. But beneath the surface, resentment festered. Mossadegh was tried for treason and sentenced to solitary confinement. When the verdict was read, he bowed and said, "My only crime is that I nationalized the oil of my country." He died under house arrest, his grave unmarked. The Shah, meanwhile, ruled with increasing brutality. His secret police, SAVAK, trained by the CIA and Mossad, crushed dissent with torture and fear. To Washington, he was our man in Tehran. To Iranians, he was a puppet. 7. Echoes through time. For a generation, the operation remained secret. Only in the late 1970s did the truth emerge, just as Iran erupted again. Crowds filled the streets, chanting not for Mossadegh but against the Shah. The 1979 Islamic Revolution swept him from power and replaced his throne with the Ayatollah's rule. When Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy that year and took hostages, they shouted about the 1953 coup. To them, this was not ancient history, it was the wound that never healed. In Washington, few connected the dots. But historians would later write, the path to 1979 began in 1953. 8. The lessons we forgot. Operation Ajax was hailed inside the CIA as a triumph, a model for covert regime change. It would inspire later operations in Guatemala, Chile, Congo, and beyond. But each victory carried the same flaw: it ignored the will of the people, replaced by secrecy and manipulation. For Americans, Ajax was supposed to protect freedom. For Iranians, it destroyed it. The collision between those two truths defines U.S. Iranian relations to this day. Even decades later, U.S. diplomats struggled to explain why their country once toppled a democracy in the name of saving democracy. 9. The declassified truth. In 2013, 60 years after the coup, the CIA finally declassified documents admitting its role. The cables were clinical references to psychological warfare, bribery of key officials, coordination with clergy. But beneath the bureaucracy lay the ghost of a nation betrayed. Kermit Roosevelt wrote his own memoir, Countercoup, describing how he had overthrown a government with a few cold drinks and a good plan. It was part confession, part brag. But he never faced a hearing, never a consequence. The U.S. called it containment. Iranians called it the death of their freedom. X, legacy and reckoning. Look back from today's world, and you can trace the fault line. 1953, coup. 1979, revolution. 1980, hostage crisis. 2000s, nuclear standoff. Every confrontation between Washington and Tehran carries the echo of that August day when democracy was traded for stability. Many Americans still don't know that their nation engineered it. Others justify it as a necessary evil of the Cold War. But the truth remains stark: Operation Ajax became the blueprint for the modern covert state. It taught Washington that you could reshape a nation without firing a shot, and taught the world that American friendship could come with hidden strings. 11. The human side. Imagine Tehran that summer. Children running through dusty alleys, mothers queuing for bread, soldiers uncertain whom to trust. In the midst of it stood Mossadegh, an old man in pajamas and slippers, trembling from illness, refusing to leave his house as the mob approached. He believed that if he simply stood his ground, reason would prevail. That his people would see through the lies. But in the roar of chaos and paid crowds, truth was drowned. His image, hands clasped, eyes sad but defiant, remains one of the most haunting in modern history. It's not just a portrait of a fallen leader. It's the face of every small nation caught between superpowers. 12. The moral question. Could America have chosen differently? At the time, officials believed they were preventing a Soviet foothold in the Middle East. They saw the world in black and white. But history lives in the gray. By toppling Mossadegh, the US won a short-term ally and lost a generation of Iranian goodwill. In doing so, it planted the seeds of future wars, sanctions, and mutual hatred. And somewhere, perhaps, in that quiet space between morality and power, lies the real lesson of Operation Ajax. That democracy imposed from outside is never democracy at all. 13. The ghost of Ajax. Every so often, American leaders mention Iran's mistrust as if it were irrational, as if it came from nowhere. But in Tehran, elders still tell their grandchildren about the day foreigners overthrew their prime minister with cash and lies. That story has become folklore, myth, and warning all at once. For them, the word Ajax is not a code name. It's a scar. 14. Epilogue, history's mirror. Today, when analysts speak of hybrid warfare, color revolutions, and information operations, they're speaking the language born in 1953. The playbook written for Ajax still circulates in think tanks, in coups that never call themselves coups. But for the people of Iran, it's not strategy, it's memory. And for Americans willing to look back honestly, it's a mirror reflecting both brilliance and blindness, the genius of a nation that could change history, and the tragedy of one that too often did so from the shadows.